I ate a tablespoon of honey, actually closer to 2 tablespoons of honey, every single day for about 30 days or so. And then I continued to do it. And I've been doing it for quite a long time. So it's longer than just 30 days. But this is what you could probably expect if you added a little bit of honey to your diet every day for 30 days. And before I get into the list and the science behind these things, let me be abundantly clear. I'm not suggesting you go and have loads and loads of honey. I'm talking about a tablespoon. In some cases, if you're using the right kind of honey, maybe even a teaspoon. We're talking about the impact of honey from an overall quality source, not just the sheer macronutrient, carbohydrate, or sugar perspective. So let's go ahead and break it down. After today's video, I put a link down below for LMNT electrolytes. So if I'm going through periods of time where I am decreasing my calories or I'm exercising a lot more, obviously electrolytes become significantly more important. And I like to sip on something that makes me feel satiated or gives me this feeling like I'm consuming something without the calories and obviously with the added benefit of an electrolyte. So I go for LMNT. So they have these sparkling electrolytes now, which are awesome because they're in a can ready to drink and they completely abolish my cravings. And there's some interesting evidence behind salt actually curbing appetite. So that could be the reason behind it. But I just love the way that they taste, especially if I'm fasting. It just makes it super easy and convenient for me. So again, that link is down below. It's drinklmnt.com/Thomas. They have their traditional stick packs with their citrus salt flavors, their grapefruit salt flavors, and then they have their new sparkling line. So check them out down below. So let's just go on down the list of things that I noticed, but things that are also backed up with scientific literature. Now, I'm going to only talk about things that are backed up with scientific literature, although I can tell you that my experiences have been significantly more than just what's on this list. Okay, so number one, you'll notice that your sweet cravings might improve. You have less in the way of sweet cravings. And this could be happening for 2 reasons. One, there's a psychological effect of having something like honey. Sometimes when you have a little bit of something sweet, it actually gives you the emotional satisfaction that you need to get through the day, feeling like you got something sweet, you got something out of it. But more importantly than that, there's an impact on what is called PYY. So we've seen this in rodent model papers, and we've even seen it in some human models, where essentially honey is increasing this gut incretin that has an effect sort of like, I don't want to say like Ozempic, but in a similar way, it affects our appetite. So we have GLP-1 and we have PYY. These are 2 things that influence our appetite significantly. Now, obviously ghrelin comes into the equation, but we'll talk about that later. Bottom line is that honey, especially when compared to regular sugar of equal GI index, ends up having a profound effect on appetite suppression. That may not be the first thing that you'll notice, but it's the first on this list. The second thing that you'll notice, especially if you are metabolically healthy, is you'll notice that your glucose levels are more stable. Now, if you are dealing with some insulin resistance or you're dealing with a little bit of metabolic distress, you might notice that after about 2 weeks or 3 weeks of just consistent use, it starts to kind of control blood glucose, especially if you sub out sugar for honey. Interestingly enough, there are different kinds of sugar. There's something called isomaltose, which doesn't fully digest and actually changes some enzymatic function when you consume that. But more importantly, a sugar called trehalose. Trehalose is a sugar that's in honey that actually inhibits the transport of some glucose. So essentially what happens is by adding in trehalose or adding in honey, you block some of the carbohydrates that you consume from actually getting utilized, like you just pass on through. So it's occupying the overall transport vehicle for them. That's why, let's just say, for hypothetical example, you had a bowl of oatmeal and you add a scoop of honey into it. If you did that instead of sugar, you'd find that your glucose levels would actually stabilize more because the trehalose can help make it so that the sugar is not being occupied in the transporter, rather the trehalose is. Number 3, there are pretty profound effects on overall caloric intake throughout the course of the day when you start the day with some honey. So there's a study that was published in the journal American College of Nutrition. Okay, what they did in this case, they gave subjects 2 450 calorie breakfasts. So they had, divided them into 2 groups. One group had 450 calories with sucrose. Another group had 450 calories with honey. They were isoglucidic, which means they had the same amount of glucose, same GI scale. Very, very similar. What they found is that the group that had the honey ended up having lower levels of glucose. They had delayed ghrelin levels, So which means that they were hungry later. Their appetite was satiated. They were controlled for longer periods of time before ghrelin increased. Ghrelin is the hunger hormone. They also, of course, have the increase in PYY that we talked about. And they ultimately ended up eating less throughout the course of the day. There are two key mechanisms here. One is the PYY, which is, again, kind of like how Ozempic works in a lot of ways, but also the ghrelin effect. Okay, if we get hungry and we eat more, then we're just going to put ourselves in a vicious cycle, right, of just blood sugar spikes and yada yada. When you look at how ghrelin works, the longer that you can delay the ghrelin response, that means that you have leptin circulating, and that means that you're going to be in a better situation to potentially burn some fat too. Number 4, and I noticed this with a DEXA scan as well, visceral fat can decrease. I can't promise you that it will. I mean, if you're still eating garbage and you're not exercising, I mean, the real keys to reduction of visceral fat are going to be like high intensity, short bouts of exercise, the use of sauna, occasional cold exposure, fasting or going for long periods of time without fuel, and occasional carbohydrate restriction. These are really important things. So don't get me wrong, like if you just added honey into a sloppy protocol altogether, it's not going to magically do things. However, there is some evidence that even a small amount of honey has an impact on cortisol, and cortisol is directly linked with visceral fat accumulation. We have chronically high levels of cortisol. Cortisol and visceral fat go hand in hand because visceral fat has a high affinity, 4 times as many cortisol receptors than anywhere else in the body. So in terms of fat accumulation, cortisol is going to impact fat accumulation in the visceral fat region more than a lot of other things, right? Now, the study was published in Biochemistry Research that found that when honey was consumed, it abolished cortisol levels, like it crushed them when they were high due to stress. But that just tells us about honey and cortisol. It doesn't tell us about visceral fat. So for this, we look at a 2013 study in the Indian Journal of Experimental Biology. Pretty wild. They took a 90% solution of honey and a 10% solution of honey, gave it to rats for 90 days, and they found that the honey solution, the higher concentration honey solution, had a reduction in visceral fat and protection against fatty liver formation. What the heck's going on there? Has to do with the antioxidants, the flavonoids, the phenolic compounds that are in honey. That's what I'm trying to say here, is that it's not really about the carbohydrates. It's about the other compounds, the types of sugars that are in it, trehalose, isomaltose, about the flavonoids, about the anti-inflammatory effect. But let's keep going. The next thing that I noticed, and a lot of people notice, is a pretty significant reduction in inflammatory cytokines and just inflammation in general. And with this, I'm going to reference a major study. This was published in Phytotherapy Research, took a look at 42 studies. Big monumental meta-analysis. They found that honey absolutely was correlated with a reduction in tumor necrosis factor alpha, a reduction in interleukin-6, and a reduction in interleukin-1 beta, and an increase in anti-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-10. But what's even cooler is they found that there is an inhibition of what's called nuclear factor kappa B. All this gobbledygook stuff, that is the master regulatory switch of inflammation. So essentially at a key genetic level is modulating inflammation. Why? It comes back down to the anti-inflammatory effect of flavonoids. I cannot get this across any harder. It's not about the sugar in this case. Honey and sugar, gram for gram, exact same amount of carbohydrates, are going to do wildly different things in the body because the anti-inflammatory effect and the flavonoids impact insulin sensitivity, they impact oxidative stress, they impact a number of different things. So there's a study published in Food Research International that looked into the mechanisms of what these flavonoids are doing. For one, yes, reduction in oxidative stress, that's a given. Number 2, there's an inhibition of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So cyclooxygenase enzyme 2, that's an inflammatory enzyme, right? That's basically what elevates when we bump our elbow or something. When you take an ibuprofen, for example, that is a cyclooxygenase 2 enzyme inhibitor. So it blocks inflammation in a localized form, right? Or somewhat, actually not localized in a lot of ways because it's not selective, so that's why you still get the gut issues. Point is that with honey, it has compounds, these flavonoids, that are actually impacting cyclooxygenase enzyme 2 from ever elevating in the first place, having a key anti-inflammatory effect. There's also a direct reduction in the expression, the formation of cytokines. Okay, point is, 42 studies, this is the part that's big. You cannot say that sugar and honey are the same. They are critically different from an inflammatory perspective. The next one, you might feel like you're significantly less stressed. There's some evidence that honey has an impact on what's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, more commonly known as the HPA axis. This is the axis in which we form cortisol, in which we form adrenaline, things like that. Okay, so if we can control that better, then maybe we're gonna be less quick to spike. If we can manage our stress better, even on the inside. Additionally, since honey can modulate the glucose effect, when you have a spike in glucose, that actually causes stress on your body, which increases cortisol. When you have honey and the antioxidant effect, it modulates that glucose, which has a therefore modulatory effect on our overall cortisol levels too. So you might notice that you just manage stress better, or at the very least have less physiological response to the stress. The next thing is there's a major shift in the gut microbiome, and I have a cool diagram to show you. So look on the screen right now. This is from the Frontiers of Nutrition. It's a really wicked cool diagram. Okay, what it shows is that when we consume honey, the simple sugars are absorbed and we utilize those. But then there's indigestible sugars and other components that move on past the small intestine into the large intestine. And we see a radical and quick shift in our gut bacteria. We see a reduction in bad bacteria and a proliferation of the good bacteria, and it happens together, which doesn't always happen. Sometimes you have changes in good bacteria, but not necessarily reductions in bad. This is a radical shift that happens fast, which explains why there's such a reduction, we can see this in the diagram, of inflammatory cytokines within the gut and an increase in things like IL-10, anti-inflammatory cytokines within the gut. Remember, so much of our systemic and chronic inflammation stems from the gut in the first place. So if we can manage that, that's a really good thing. Not to mention, honey has prebiotic fibers in it to begin with, which are just great for our gut, short-chain fatty acids, great for overall inflammatory responses within the body, you name it. The next thing is you might notice an immunomodulatory effect. What that means is you might notice that you fight off pathogens a little bit better. And in fact, that same diagram that I just showed you on the gut health thing showed that the microbes or the antimicrobial activity of honey has an impact on pathogens in the gut itself. Okay, so I can speak with absolute clarity based on this diagram that that is a powerful thing. Okay, I don't want to go into the weeds too much because YouTube doesn't always like me talking about this kind of content when it has to do with pathogens and whatnot, but there is evidence out there. If you look at the MGO content of certain honey, like Manuka honey with an MGO content of maybe 600 plus, try to look for that. That has a pretty powerful antimicrobial, antibacterial effect. And we've seen the evidence when it comes down to honey on many of these kinds of things. One thing that I can speak from my own personal experience is that it made a huge difference for me. Big difference there from the immunomodulatory side of things. The last thing that I was even skeptical about mentioning, because it can be hard to talk about online because it's so somewhat controversial, I guess, is you might see a reduction in triglycerides, a reduction in LDL cholesterol, and an increase in your HDL cholesterol. And there's some interesting hypotheses as to why this might happen, and also some decent data in general. There's a 7-study systematic review that looked at honey consumption. They found that those that were consuming honey or added honey into their diet saw an increase in their HDL, reduction in their LDL, reduction in their serum triglycerides, most importantly, a reduction in the oxidized LDL, which is really what causes a problem because that's what ultimately leads to the larger sort of foamy cells that we don't want that can contribute to atherosclerosis and these other problems. So a major reduction in oxidized LDL. But essentially what could be going on from a mechanistic perspective is there are these things called niacin-like substances, which influence how lipids are sort of broken down and potentially excreted. So honey, if you've ever noticed, it can kind of get foamy, it's reactive, right? And there's evidence to support that even within the body, it has these reactive components, which is why it can scavenge free radicals and neutralize that, but also has an impact on our lipids in our blood, altering our cholesterol, making it so that maybe we just excrete it better. I don't want to get ahead of myself because we need more evidence to really say anything concretely, but the evidence is starting to point in the favor of, hey, yeah, honey could be beneficial here. And one thing that we can say with absolute certainty is that honey is better than regular sugar. So if you like sugar, if you like things that are sweet and you can't get in the park of maybe using monk fruit or stevia all the time, at the very least switch to honey. But from sort of a just additive component, try adding a tablespoon of honey per day and just see what happens. I'll see you tomorrow.